In the late 70s and throughout the 80s, the film industry painted a portrait of what life was like for your average teenager in high school, commonly satirizing the institution as a dull prison juxtaposed with the eager imaginations of its young prisoners.
House of Representatives in an effort to alleviate the effects of the... Anyone? The Great Depression.
The common clique was established, and stories of jocks, emos, cool kids, middle-of-the-roaders, and yes, nerds were all told.
Get those nerds! Nerds!
The common theme in these films was high school, a period when our imaginations were rife with thoughts of being someone else, someone better than ourselves. We daydreamed, and our dreams took us outside those classroom walls to someplace where we made a difference. Today, we look at a title that puts the player in the shoes of an awkward teenager who, perhaps unwittingly, acts to save everyone from the schemes of a group bent on global dominion. He'll do so with a bit of antisocial charisma and the willingness to indulge in his imagination and become someone better, a hero. Through broken glasses, we look at Super Daryl Deluxe. Over the course of my work for Broken Glasses, I've come to develop a great appreciation for hand-drawn art, be it by literal hand or digital. I'll explain. One of the biggest obstacles for the game industry in the production of convincing 3D characters is the proper replication of the nuanced patterns that define movement. The example I like to use is the difference between a character whose hands possess a wide range of motion in the joints and one whose hands never deviate from a static open palm, like a Lego figure or something. Real people are anything but static, and a character that animates as such takes me out of the overall experience. Not necessarily at the expense of my enjoyment, but a dose of escapism is kept in the bottle. Compare that to the drawing and animation of a 2D character and their every detail frame by frame. Be it an art style that aims to be hyper-realistic or art that is abstract, the result is a subject that moves believably within the space because no concessions have been made to define that movement, such as with the Lego palm. If you consider the common usage of vibrant colors and shaders and combine that with the plethora of styles and effects you can achieve, then you'll have an understanding of why I'm far more impressed with the visual achievements of this type of game nowadays than by their 3D cousins, with some notable exceptions. So, when I came across Dan and Gary Games' Super Daryl Deluxe, and I bore witness to the titular character enthusiastically smacking people about with a rhino attached to a stick, I knew I had to reach out and ask for a peek at what exactly they were working on. The result of my inquiry wasn't just a peek behind the curtain, but a full-blown tour of the entire theater, and after roughly 6 hours, I've garnered a fair understanding of what makes Super Daryl Deluxe tick. The game is a 2D RPG brawler that tells its story from the perspective of an awkward teenager just looking to make friends, Daryl. The social anxieties that come with being the new kid at school serve as the framework for Daryl's misadventurous attempts to impress himself upon his classmates, which eventually lead to his involvement in a larger plot of mind control, betrayal, and world domination. With a combat system boasting dozens of skills and passive abilities, you'll slug your way through portals to alternate dimensions, time travel and meet with historical figures, and occasionally engage in mano-a-mano bouts with school personnel. The game begins with a bit of exposition, detailing the 1975 graduation of two students from Waterfalls High School, Eli Bavarius and Kent Hangerman. As valedictorian and salutatorian respectively, the two boys leave with high honors and, after some discussion, come up with a plan to write self-help books that will benefit the world and define their legacy. 40 years later, Kent Hangerman is now principal, and Daryl Whitelaw has arrived at the school and is introduced by Vice Principal Mr. Roboto to students Paul and Alan. After a somewhat uncomfortable introduction, Paul and Alan decide that Daryl's unique propensity for making friends makes him a perfect fit as product manager of Paul and Alan's textbook emporium, which is basically a fancy way of saying that they steal textbooks and then resell them to the students. The textbook market, however, has already been cornered by a group of students known as the Trenchcoat Kids, who collectively parody the stereotypical shady man in an alley selling you Quaaludes, or the obscure merchant in many a role-playing game. I personally like to think of them as being more like this guy.
Got something that might interest you.
The build I was sent only contained the first 2 chapters of the eventual 6, so the overall narrative didn't progress much further than the occasional bit of foreshadowing. But it's clear that Principal Hangerman is up to something, and is now using his old alma mater as a platform from which to launch the beginning phases of his scheme. As rewards for you continuing to supply them with textbooks, Paul and Alan decide they'll periodically give you pages out of a self-help book they stole from Principal Hangerman's office. The book is called Interacting with Others, and this transitions us nicely into a discussion of the game's combat and leveling mechanics. In Super Daryl Deluxe, textbooks act as the currency with which you'll buy new pages, or, more specifically, new combat skills. The skills are titled after what could be chapters in Interacting with Others, such as the first skill you receive, titled Discuss Differences, a multi-hit combo. There's others, such as Crushing Realization, What Goes Around, Shocking Statements, and so on. The entire skill system is effectively one big metaphor for the utilization of the self-help book to better Daryl's interaction with others, with the application of its instructions resulting in an ironic beatdown of his enemies. It also ties well into the overarching narrative, which hints at the corruptive power of these books and how the knowledge therein can be used nefariously. Skills vary in cost depending on their base effectiveness in combat. The current tier of the skill is indicated in its description, but generally speaking, skills that cost a single textbook will be labeled as trash, those that cost 4 are good, and those costing 7 will be excellent. It's a nice, easy way to measure one's progression and what skills you ought to be saving up for and what ones you might consider shelving. Skills can all be upgraded in rank, increasing their effectiveness and making it so that even trash tier skills can last you a while. Max rank varies from skill to skill, sometimes maxing out at 3, 5, 7, or even 15. Most skills also enjoy a cosmetic change when upgraded, the easiest example being seen in the skill Crushing Realization, which begins as a simple wooden mallet and ends with the aforementioned rhino. You'll increase the rank of skills by spending skill experience, which is earned alongside normal experience. Alternatively, if you've got a few textbooks laying around, you can convert them directly into skill experience. So you've got the skills, what's combat like? I must admit that in the beginning I fell under the slight impression that combat was going to be punchy, that is to say, absent complexity. In the beginning stages of the game, when you only have a single skill to work with, the absence of a dedicated dodge is felt, and all you have to escape damage is a double jump, which you have right out of the gate, or a ducking maneuver, both of which do see use. As the game went on, however, and my repertoire of skills grew, I began to see that combat greatly emphasized offense over defense, and not necessarily in a brain-dead way. Skills have cooldowns, and so the fun of customizing your kit comes in the form of optimizing it, so that by the time you finish chaining moves together, you're ready to begin again, preferably before your enemies can react. There's a lot of variety in how you can approach combat. You can be a close-quarter specialist, mixing in-your-face combos with crowd-controlling AoE, or you can choose to be a ranged stunner, assaulting your foes with a barrage of bananas and arrows, stopping them before they get too close with bolts of electricity. Just as effort has been put into how you fight, effort has been put into what you fight. The game's boss encounters all possess varying degrees of complexity involving the player's study of the boss's attacks, the environment, and the skills the player may bring into battle. Chapter-ending bosses usually had some sort of clever gimmick attached to them, while bosses encountered during the game's side quests were arguably much tougher, requiring an understanding of their attack patterns and the appropriate counters. Combat in Super Daryl Deluxe is diverse across the board, and I was extremely impressed with how far developed it is at this stage, despite the fact that the game is still at least a year off from release, I'm told. The system is fluid, and the variety of skills and cosmetic upgrades that are available ensure the experience stays fresh, which is important as the game does facilitate farming and overleveling. Paired with combat is a fairly basic equipment system. On top of health, money, and junk, enemies will occasionally drop gear that is categorized as a weapon, hat, outfit, or accessory, and can then be worn as such. Equipment items can offer benefits to either your max health, your strength, or your defense, and will occasionally come with a passive ability that is only available if you're wearing them. Your gear choices aren't actually reflected in-game outside of the humorous pencil sketch inside your notebook, which is a little bit of a disappointment, but understandable when you take into consideration the way combat and skills operate. I mean, besides, how often does Final Fantasy let you show off your bangles? If I'm being honest, Super Daryl Deluxe very much reminded me of Obsidian Entertainment's South Park: The Stick of Truth, as both games are set within a satiric vision of Middle America, featuring characters that are effectively numb to the ridiculousness of what's going on around them. This reminiscence continued throughout my time with the game, not simply because of its thematic similarities to South Park, and I say thematic because Super Daryl Deluxe doesn't deal in the crude, but also its cast, all of whom possess character-defining physical and personal traits that set them apart from each other and make each encounter memorable. Dan and Gary Games have built a world. As a result, questing in Super Daryl Deluxe features interactions that are just as diverse as the combat, thanks in particular to the game's featured cast of historical and popular fictional characters who now find themselves entangled with one another in a modern setting, no less numb to the lunacy than the kids going to school there. Making these interactions possible are tears in space and time dotted throughout the school, with what's found on the other side being reflective of where the anomaly is taking place. The earliest example in the game is found in the science lab, where you're transported to a dimension resembling something out of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. In fact, literally as I write this, I realize that Super Daryl Deluxe could effectively be described as Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, the game, if perhaps Bill and Ted were instead replaced by a mute Napoleon Dynamite. Now, it's great that both the game's combat and its environments are diverse, as the quests were for the most part unfortunately dull fetch or kill quests. There were certainly some creative moments, such as one puzzle that required me to jump on the keys of a piano in a certain order to open a door. It was appropriately themed with my being with Beethoven at the time, and it was a nice break from all the combat. Unfortunately, the next room was just another gauntlet, which was disappointing as the quest I was on at the time referenced a series of trials, and so the piano puzzle gave me the impression that I'd be using more than my fists going forward. Now don't get me wrong, the combat in Super Daryl Deluxe is great, and it certainly deserves attention, but what I don't necessarily want is for the game to use combat as a crutch to lean on whenever it comes time to test the player. Not all the time, anyway. Environmental brain teasers were few and far in between, and I think that given the scope of what Daryl can do, there's plenty of room to challenge the player on more than just their fighting prowess. Now keep in mind that I only played the first 2 chapters of the game, so it's entirely possible that these criticisms have already been addressed in the later stages. Now, one final thing of note that I particularly enjoyed the concept behind was a side quest that appears will span the entirety of your adventure, the Beta Boss Reconstruction Engine. In the school, there's a group of students playing dwarves and druids, which is this game's version of Dungeons & Dragons, and it's via your interactions with these students that you're given basic gameplay tips and so on and so forth when the game begins. That's not all they're good for, however, as early on you're given a quest to help piece together this reconstruction engine, which will then allow you to have a rematch with some of the game's bosses encountered on side quests you've already completed. In the demo, I got to have a rematch with Lord Glockenspiel, the climactic final boss of the aforementioned quest chain I was on with Beethoven. With each victory, I was awarded a key, and that key would open one of 4 chests containing special equipment that could only be obtained from the boss. Now, I love this concept and how it adds replayability to some of the game's memorable encounters, but I do have one issue with it. It's too easy. Once I got a bead on Glockenspiel's attack patterns, I could easily defeat him each and every time, which in turn diminished the feeling of earning that special piece of equipment. It felt like normal farming. What I'd like to see are maybe special mutators attached to each fight that can make things not necessarily more difficult per se, but more interesting, that change the boss in some way from the initial encounter. Mutators like a time limit, or maybe you go into battle with a specific set of abilities that can't be changed, or maybe double jump is disabled, and so on. After all, this is effectively an arcade mode within the main game, so I feel it should reflect that by offering a creative challenge. They've already beaten the boss once. Beating it another 4 times should be made a more interesting and more rewarding experience. I did greatly enjoy my time with the demo despite some of my criticisms. I was never not having fun, which is ultimately the most important thing, but there are certainly ways to improve the experience and make it even more so, which is where most of my criticisms are rooted. It's a matter of refinement at the end of the day for me, which is an extremely good look for a game still a ways off from completion. Dan and Gary Games are developing something special with Super Daryl Deluxe, and you should definitely keep an eye out for its tentative launch in 2018. In the meantime, there will be links below to where you too can follow development, and if you want to know more about upcoming indie games, be sure to follow me on Twitter @BrokeGlasses. My name's Kevin Ryan, and thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.